against an inevitable tide of history?
Well, we see machine breaking continue in the 19th century, so they're not the last wave of machine breaking. I think they did raise awareness about the problems of workers losing their rights over apprentices, they're losing their rights over the minimum wage, for example. So I think without them, we wouldn't know as much about the conditions of life being changed so rapidly by industrialisation.
Well, I think that is a very comprehensive look at the history of Luddism from 200 years ago. But, of course, one of the reasons, particularly with this Free Thinking Festival, which is concentrating on the idea of change, that we want to look at it, is that it has an awful lot of echoes for the present day. And I wonder, in a sense, if we could just look briefly at the sense in which that word has changed. Because I think we've established absolutely definitely that at the time, being a Luddite did not mean being opposed to technology or even being incompetent with technology. And yet it's come to have that sort of meaning. Now, I wonder if that tells us, Bill, something about our own attitudes towards technology in the modern age.
I fear it tells us more about attitudes towards journalists, towards looking for cliches and easy ways to dismiss people, and that we've actually taken this word, which has such a depth of meaning, oversimplified it, and in fact turned its meaning around just because it often makes a good headline. And then you've got a lot of people who are willing to be described as Luddites because somehow to them saying I'm a Luddite doesn't sound so bad. It's almost as if a badge of pride, even though they're claiming something that has no historical veracity. So I wouldn't want to draw too much out of the changing meaning of the word.
But doesn't sound as bad as what, Bill? What would be the more honest way in terms of what you're saying to phrase it if you wouldn't call yourself, not yourself, but oneself a Luddite?
Well, OK, I'm not a Luddite in the sense of the contemporary sense of it, as in I have embraced technology, as anyone who knows me will tell you, and I'm very happy with that situation. The people who say to me, somehow with a sense of pride, oh, I'm a bit of a Luddite around this, are generally dismissing the technology and claiming it is not important enough for them to pay attention to. So it doesn't seem to come from fear so much as a failure of understanding or a sense of superiority to it. So that what they're saying is, I can't be bothered with this, and it doesn't really matter. And that attitude I find quite worrying, because it doesn't worry people. It's like saying, oh, I don't understand maths. You know, if you say, oh, I've never read any Shakespeare, you should be embarrassed. If you say, I don't know what Gödel's theorem is, nobody thinks that reflects badly on you.
Well, other mathematicians may do so, of course, but Andrew?
I think one of the problems is this sort of the unhelpful simplification that you get in just that kind of journalistic debate. But I think it's also a feature of politics and politicians who are always looking for simple, bright, shiny solutions to things. So you have a situation in which, in the modern world, a new technology is always equated to automatically being something to do with progress. And therefore, if you ask questions about it, you get cast in the light of being anti-modern and anti-progress. Whereas, in fact, I think the best spirit of the Luddites is this sort of healthy scepticism about looking at the overall benefits, economic, social benefits, and saying, well, is this thing going to leave us better off or not? So it's more about kind of a healthy scepticism.
But isn't there a sense in which, Andrew, the way in which technology is sometimes placed before us is not as a choice of take it or leave it, but almost kind of a gun pointed to the head, not literally, one hopes, but, the sense of an ultimatum?
Well, I think this is the problem, and I think too often new technologies are presented as ultimatums rather than choices. And I think there's always more than one pathway to achieve a certain thing, whether it's to do with energy security, whether it's to do with kind of feeding the world. There are always multiple pathways, and the choices you make about which technologies you use reflect your social values, they reflect where you sit in the grand scheme of things, whether you are powerless or powerful, whether you sit in a big corporation or whether you're a small farmer in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think what we need to do is say it's okay to ask questions of technologies, to analyse them for whether they bring overall benefits, whose interests they work in, who's controlling them.
Can I just say, I think you're conflating two different things here slightly, because we're here, we're a Western audience in an industrial economy. For many people in their jobs, they have no choice over the technologies that are deployed in the workplace. It really isn't take it or leave it, it's take it or leave. And as a result, there's this belief that the technology is just imposed. In the broader sphere, in terms of the political decisions that have to be made, the discussions as a society, I think you're absolutely right. But somehow people feel disempowered because they have so little control over the technologies in their own lives, particularly in the workplace, and that is then reflected in a sense of disempowerment in the political sphere where it is not appropriate.
Katrina, is it possible still to be a Luddite in this day and age?
Their socially acceptable alternative was to base work within a community, within small workshops, where everyone knew each other, and perhaps we are moving towards that realisation again that we need a bit more control from below over what economically we can produce.
I actually think there's a really good modern-day example of successful Luddism, and it's the free or open-source software movement. It's the recognition that the control of the programs that are running on your computer, if it lies in the hand of faceless corporations and you have no control, you can't look at the source code, you can't modify it yourself, takes power away from you. And the only solution to that is to do, as a great computer scientist called Richard Stallman began in the 1980s, to make your own, to write your own software, to make it freely available for everyone. And if anything, the Luddites of today is the free and open source software movement, and they're winning. That their systems are actually in use everywhere and are doing very well.
I'd throw in another example, and this is not only the 200th anniversary of the Luddites, it's also the 100th anniversary of the birth of E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, whose critique looked at technology, it looked at the nature and patterns of work, and he also said that one of the most important things in terms of the conviviality of a working life is this having control over your time. But perhaps on the streets in Britain today, the great living example of applying a sort of Luddism, a scepticism, questions about appropriateness of technology, is the Transition Town movement, who are looking at local food chains, local energy chains, and asking questions about how we can design more convivial economies by looking at the appropriateness of the technologies we use.
But realistically, Bill and Andrew, I mean, aren't the examples you've given, well, there are nice specific examples of cases where a sort of neo-Luddism has power, actually ignoring the wider context of the early 21st century, which is about the corporation. I mean, essentially, these are huge corporate enterprises which underpin all of these various areas. If we didn't have the corporations, we wouldn't have the space in which the open source software movement operates. And is this really about getting a nicer sort of manager rather than actually giving the little guy or the little gal a chance to fight back?
Well, that's a deeply cynical point of view. And,
Thank you.
And it implies the corporations have done so well that, we should be lauding them and just resting into their gentle embrace, which I don't think we want to do. No, I think there is something...
It's not to praise them, Bill. It's to talk about what seems in some senses to be the real situation of what lies behind all this. I mean, is that too pessimistic rather than cynical of you?
I think it's about layers, actually. It's about where you can make an intervention and expect to make a difference. And the fact is that modern society, in the modern world, relies on an enormous amount of technologies which are now bedded in and established, and an enormous number of processes and procedures which are the normal way of doing business. And they are very hard to change. The Occupy movement that's happening at the moment is a very small attempt to say out loud, this is not right and we need to rethink it, but this is its very early stages. The examples we were both talking about, Andrew and I were talking about, are at a layer where you can do something which makes a difference, and they should give hope to people. You can then make greater interventions and at deeper levels.
So, Andrew, what are the technologies, then, on which the modern Luddite should be seeking to bring up some sort of opposition? Is it GM? Is it the use of the internet? Where should they be turning their Luddite fire?
Well, there's a couple of things I would point out straight away. And we've mentioned the Occupy movement and people's deep unease at the nature of the markets. Well, let's not forget that it's a little bit of computer-assisted technology and a few fancy algorithms that wholly misunderstood the risks that were being taken with complex financial instruments and caused the largest amount of economic damage that we've seen in living memory. So I think there's a little bit of kind of a healthy way of looking at the use of technology in financial markets. Another one, which is a huge debate at the moment, and actually one which is seeing sort of fissures within the British scientific establishment, is over questions of how the world feeds itself. You have, on the one hand, Professor Bob Watson, who's Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, who was part of something called the International Assessment of Agricultural Science, Technology and Development. He reckons that one of the best ways you can feed the world is by supporting small farmers, looking at how you can support the development of local crop systems. Then you had someone like John Beddington, who's the government's chief scientific advisor, who went much more down the route of kind of high-tech applications and the use of global commodity markets. Deep, deep debate there about which branch to take, which has profoundly different conclusions for the people on the ground.
And Katrina, isn't there a danger that, like Lord Byron, we may over-romanticise? I mean, the fact is that global agribusiness may have an awful lot of flaws, but one could argue it's fed an awful lot more people over the course of the last 50 or 100 years as well.
Yes, I think one of the groups that followed the Luddites were the swing writers, and they were the people who were opposing the agricultural change in the south of England. But again, they were defending their sense of ownership over common land, but also over the farming practices. So it's not just about opposing the agricultural revolution for the sake of it, but it's actually giving workers a say and a right in what they're producing.
One of the things that's very noticeable, I think, at the moment about the current tenor of politics is that it seems almost to be behind the times of the technology. And this comes to mind because essentially the changes that Katrina's been outlining, which have continued to have their effects over 200 years, are about politics, society and technology entwined with each other. Do we have a political class that essentially doesn't understand the implications of current technological change, an actual ignorance, the kind of classic sense of, or rather popular sense of being Luddites? Or is it actually that they do understand perfectly well what's going on, but it's to their advantage not to expose it too much?
I don't think it's either of those, actually. I think today's politicians are in an impossible situation, which is that the technology itself, particularly information technology, is moving so fast that they cannot even begin to encompass its significance. That if you become Prime Minister in 2010, then by the time you leave office in 2014, 2015, the computers in people's pockets are 100 times more powerful. The network is 100 times faster. A billion more people are online. None of us understands the real implications of that. And to ask career politicians to be technological forecasters as well is just impossible. And they don't have the people around them who really understand. Yeah, we are all, to some extent, working in the dark here. It's just the politicians are making decisions now which will bind us in 5 years' time in an environment that is, at the moment, really quite unpredictable.
Bill, we're always inclined to think, and in some cases maybe right, that the times that we live in are more fast-changing, more of a transition than anything previously in history. But using some perspective, do you think that actually the pace of change is moving faster than 200 years ago, 400 years ago? Is there actually a sort of genuine exponential leap in the rate of change?
I always try not to take that particular point of view. I think being an internet particularist and thinking this is a completely special time is very dangerous. So I wouldn't say that this decade is, but I would say this 50-year period is.
What was interesting when I looked at the OED definition of Luddism is that the first incidence of it being used as meaning anti-technology in the 1970s. So before then, we understood a bit more about what Luddism meant historically, but from the 1970s onwards, that's when we get that anti-technology definition.
I think one of the things which is definitively different about the modern age is our ability to deploy at vast scale new innovations across great swathes of territory. And I think I mentioned E.F. Schumacher earlier, and I think one of the interesting things about him, and one of the reasons why he thought that we should always default to the making decisions at the lowest possible order, this notion of subsidiarity, or small is beautiful, as his book was called. And the reason that he talked about that is because he thought there was wisdom in smallness, if only on account of the smallness and patchiness of human knowledge, which relies more on experiment than on understanding, and that problems occur when you apply on a vast scale things in which we don't understand the fully